In late December 2025, the DEA announced they had dismantled what they're calling a superlab network that was manufacturing methamphetamine on an industrial scale. Federal agents raided multiple locations across 3 states, arrested 27 individuals, and seized approximately 3 tons of methamphetamine, along with the equipment and chemicals used to produce it. To put that quantity in perspective, 3 tons is 6,000 pounds of methamphetamine. That's enough drugs to supply millions of doses to users across the country, and the manufacturing capacity the DEA discovered suggests this network was capable of producing even larger quantities on an ongoing basis. Today, I'm walking you through what happened in this operation, explaining how these massive drug laboratories operate, and discussing what this case tells us about methamphetamine production and the cartels behind it. The Takedown. On December 28, 2025, the Drug Enforcement Administration, working with state and local law enforcement partners, executed coordinated raids at 7 locations across California, Arizona, and Nevada. These locations included what DEA describes as superlabs, large-scale methamphetamine manufacturing facilities capable of producing hundreds of pounds of drugs per production cycle. The operation resulted in the arrest of 27 individuals charged with conspiracy to manufacture and distribute methamphetamine. The lead defendants include Mexican nationals with alleged connections to the Sinaloa cartel, as well as American citizens who were working with the cartel to operate manufacturing facilities on U.S. soil. At the raided locations, DEA agents discovered active methamphetamine laboratories in various stages of production. Some labs were in the middle of cooking batches of meth when agents arrived. Others had just completed production and were in the process of packaging finished product for distribution. The total seizure from all 7 locations was staggering: approximately 3 tons, 6,000 pounds, of finished methamphetamine ready for distribution. Over 2,000 pounds of precursor chemicals used to manufacture methamphetamine, the raw materials for producing even more drugs. Manufacturing equipment including industrial-scale glassware, heating elements, ventilation systems, and other apparatus used in large-scale drug production, $1.2 million in cash, 14 firearms, including assault rifles, 23 vehicles used in the operation. The locations of these superlabs varied. 2 were in rural areas of California's Central Valley, hidden in agricultural warehouses that appeared from the outside to be legitimate farm operations. 2 were in industrial areas of the Phoenix, Arizona metropolitan area, operating inside what appeared to be small manufacturing or storage facilities, and 3 were in remote desert locations in Nevada, in structures specifically built or modified for drug manufacturing. DEA Acting Administrator Timothy Shea stated in the announcement, "This operation has dealt a significant blow to the Sinaloa cartel's methamphetamine production capabilities in the United States. We've dismantled an industrial-scale drug manufacturing operation that was poisoning American communities." All 27 arrested individuals were taken into federal custody. They're being held without bond due to the serious nature of the charges and the flight risk they pose. Many face mandatory minimum sentences of 10 years to life in federal prison if convicted, given the quantities of drugs involved. The DEA stated this investigation was part of Operation Crystal Shield, a nationwide initiative targeting methamphetamine trafficking and the criminal organizations behind it. The evolution of meth manufacturing. To understand the significance of this superlab takedown, we need to understand how methamphetamine manufacturing has evolved and why these large-scale laboratories have become such a serious problem. Methamphetamine is a synthetic stimulant drug manufactured in laboratories using precursor chemicals. Unlike drugs like cocaine or heroin that are derived from plants, methamphetamine is entirely man-made, which means it can be produced anywhere that manufacturers can obtain the necessary chemicals and equipment. For many years, much of the methamphetamine consumed in the United States was produced in small-scale laboratories, often called mom-and-pop labs. These were typically operated by individual users or small groups who would cook small batches of meth using methods they learned from the internet or from other users. In 2004, the DEA seized over 17,000 of these small labs nationwide. These small labs were dangerous because the chemicals involved are toxic and flammable, leading to frequent explosions, fires, and environmental contamination. But over the past 15 years, methamphetamine production has increasingly shifted to large-scale operations controlled by Mexican drug cartels. These organizations discovered they could produce methamphetamine much more efficiently and profitably using industrial-scale manufacturing processes. The cartels, particularly the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, began establishing what law enforcement calls superlabs in Mexico. These are sophisticated facilities that can produce hundreds of pounds of methamphetamine in a single production cycle. By 2015, the number of small domestic labs seized had dropped to around 9,000 annually, and by 2020, it had fallen to just 2,500, a dramatic 85% decline from the 2004 peak. This wasn't because meth was less available, it was because cartels had industrialized production. The cartels invested in industrial equipment, hired chemists with expertise in drug synthesis, and developed efficient production methods that could generate massive quantities of high-purity methamphetamine. Today's cartel-produced meth averages 97% purity, compared to 60–70% purity from the old small-scale labs. The methamphetamine produced in these Mexican superlabs was then smuggled across the border into the United States, where it was distributed through cartel networks to dealers and eventually to users. This Mexican-produced meth largely replaced the small-scale domestic production that had previously dominated the market. But what DEA discovered in this recent case is that cartels are now establishing superlabs inside the United States as well. There are several reasons for this shift. First, manufacturing drugs inside the U.S. eliminates the need to smuggle finished product across the border, which is where many shipments are intercepted by law enforcement. In 2024, CBP seized over 35,000 pounds of meth at the border, but that represents only an estimated 10 to 15% of what actually crosses. Second, it allows cartels to respond more quickly to market demand rather than having to coordinate production in Mexico and transportation across the border. And third, it may provide higher profit margins since they don't have to pay the costs associated with smuggling. The precursor chemicals used to manufacture methamphetamine are typically imported from China or produced by chemical companies that may not know their products are being diverted to drug manufacturing. The most important precursor is pseudoephedrine or ephedrine, though cartels have developed methods using other chemicals when these are restricted. The superlabs that DEA raided in this operation were using what's known as the P2P method of methamphetamine production. This method doesn't require pseudoephedrine, which has been restricted in the United States since the passage of the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act in 2005. Instead, the P2P method uses phenyl-2-propanone and other chemicals that are harder to regulate because they have legitimate industrial uses. According to DEA, the sophistication of the labs they raided suggests they were set up and operated by individuals with significant expertise in chemistry and drug manufacturing. These weren't amateur operations. They had industrial-grade equipment, proper ventilation systems to handle toxic fumes, temperature control systems for the chemical reactions, and efficient processes for purifying the final product. One lab in California had equipment worth an estimated $400,000 alone. How the investigation unfolded. The investigation that resulted in the superlab takedown began in early 2025. DEA agents in California had received intelligence about large-scale methamphetamine manufacturing operations in their area of responsibility. The initial intelligence came from multiple sources. Some came from informants within drug trafficking organizations who provided information about cartel operations in exchange for reduced sentences on their own charges. Some came from analysis of drug seizures. DEA tracks the purity and chemical signatures of seized methamphetamine to identify likely sources. And some came from monitoring of communications between cartel members in Mexico and their associates in the United States. DEA investigators began focusing on a group of individuals they suspected were involved in operating manufacturing labs. They conducted surveillance, documenting where these individuals went, who they met with, and what activities they were engaged in. One key technique was monitoring purchases of chemicals and equipment. Even though the P2P method doesn't use pseudoephedrine, it still requires chemicals that need to be purchased from suppliers. DEA works with chemical companies and distributors to identify suspicious purchases. When someone orders large quantities of certain chemicals that could be used in drug manufacturing, particularly if they're using false identities or shell companies to make the purchases, that can trigger DEA scrutiny. Through this monitoring, DEA identified several companies and individuals who were purchasing chemicals and equipment consistent with large-scale methamphetamine production. In one case, a front company in Phoenix ordered 800 pounds of phenylacetic acid, a legitimate industrial chemical but also a meth precursor, over a 6-month period. Agents obtained court authorization to track these purchases and to identify the locations where the materials were being delivered. DEA also used aerial surveillance. When investigators suspected labs might be operating in rural or remote areas, they used aircraft to photograph facilities and look for indicators of drug manufacturing. These indicators might include unusual security measures, modified ventilation systems, generators providing power to buildings that aren't connected to the electrical grid, or chemical waste being disposed of improperly. In this case, DEA identified several locations in California, Arizona, and Nevada that had characteristics suggesting they might be drug labs. Investigators then focused surveillance resources on these specific sites. Thermal imaging cameras detected one Nevada lab because of the excessive heat generated by the chemical reactions. The building was consistently 20-30 degrees warmer than surrounding structures. One particularly valuable tool was monitoring of financial transactions. The cartel members operating these labs needed to pay for chemicals, equipment, rent on facilities, salaries for workers, and various other operational costs. DEA financial investigators tracked suspicious money movements, identifying accounts that were receiving large deposits from sources connected to Mexican cartels and then making payments to suppliers of chemicals and equipment. One coordinator moved $2.7 million through various shell company accounts over an 18-month period. DEA also obtained court authorization for wiretaps on the phones of key suspects. Through intercepted communications, agents were able to hear conversations about drug production, distribution plans, and coordination with cartel leadership in Mexico. These communications provided direct evidence of the conspiracy and helped DEA understand the structure and scope of the operation. One intercepted call captured a cartel boss in Sinaloa ordering a production increase to 800 pounds by the end of the month. By late November 2025, DEA believed they had sufficient evidence to take down the entire network. They had identified 7 laboratory locations, 27 individuals involved in the operation, and the cartel connections behind the enterprise. The raids were carefully planned and coordinated. Taking down methamphetamine labs is inherently dangerous. The chemicals involved are toxic and explosive. Labs often have security measures, including armed guards. And the people operating labs know they're facing serious prison time if caught, which can make them desperate. DEA assembled tactical teams, including special agents trained in high-risk operations. They coordinated with local SWAT teams and with hazardous materials teams who could safely handle the toxic chemicals. And they synchronized the timing of the raids so that all 7 locations could be hit simultaneously, preventing anyone at one location from warning the others. On December 28th, the raids were executed. All 27 suspects were arrested without major incident. At several locations, agents arrived while meth was actively being cooked, requiring hazmat teams to stabilize the chemical reactions before agents could safely enter and gather evidence. At the California agricultural warehouse, agents found workers in the middle of a production run that would have yielded an estimated 320 pounds of finished meth. The seized drugs, chemicals, and equipment were documented, photographed, and either secured as evidence or properly disposed of by environmental specialists. How the network operated this manufacturing operation was controlled by the Sinaloa cartel one of Mexico's most powerful drug trafficking organizations. The Sinaloa cartel has extensive experience operating methamphetamine superlabs in Mexico and has been expanding operations into the United States. The network had a clear hierarchical structure. At the top were cartel leaders based in Mexico who provided overall direction, financial backing, and connections to chemical suppliers. These leaders made strategic decisions about where to establish labs, how much to produce, and how to distribute the finished product. Below the top leadership were several coordinators based in the United States. These individuals were responsible for finding suitable locations for labs, recruiting workers, obtaining chemicals and equipment, and managing day-to-day operations. According to the indictment, at least 3 of the 27 arrested individuals were these coordinators. The actual cooks, the people who manufactured the methamphetamine, were a mix of Mexican nationals with expertise in drug production and American citizens who had been trained in the manufacturing process. Operating a superlab requires real chemical knowledge and expertise. You can't just follow a recipe from the internet when you're working with industrial quantities of toxic and dangerous chemicals. Each of the 7 labs had between 2 and 5 workers present at any given time. These workers would conduct production runs that could take anywhere from several hours to several days, depending on the quantity being produced and the specific method being used. The labs operated in cycles. Workers would bring in precursor chemicals, conduct a production run, purify and package the finished methamphetamine, clean the equipment, and then begin another cycle. A superlab operating at full capacity can produce several hundred pounds of meth per week. According to intercepted communications, the most productive lab, one of the California operations, was producing approximately 200 pounds per month. Security was a priority. The labs had lookouts and surveillance cameras to watch for law enforcement or rival traffickers. Some locations had armed guards, and the operations used compartmentation, meaning workers at one lab didn't necessarily know about the other labs, limiting the damage if one location was discovered. The finished methamphetamine was packaged in bulk quantities, typically in kilogram packages wrapped in plastic. These packages would be transported to distribution hubs where they would be broken down into smaller quantities and distributed to regional dealers throughout the southwestern United States and beyond. Surveillance documented shipments leaving the labs headed for distribution networks in 11 different states. The financial scale of this operation was enormous. 3 tons of methamphetamine has a wholesale value of approximately $25 to $30 million depending on purity and market conditions. At street-level retail prices, broken down and sold by the gram, that 3 tons could generate over $120 million in revenue. The average street price for meth in 2025 is approximately $60–80 per gram, though prices vary significantly by region. The cartel's cost to operate these 7 superlabs would have included rent on the facilities, estimated at $15,000 to $20,000 per month total, purchases of chemicals and equipment, approximately $500,000 to $800,000 over the operational period. Salaries for workers and coordinators. Workers typically receive $2,000 to $5,000 per production cycle. Transportation costs, and various other operational expenses. But even with all these costs, the profit margins on methamphetamine are extraordinarily high, which is why cartels invest heavily in manufacturing operations. By the numbers. The 3 tons of methamphetamine seized in this operation equals approximately 6,000 pounds, or roughly 2.7 million grams. A typical dose of methamphetamine for a user might be anywhere from 25 to 100 milligrams, depending on tolerance and method of use. That means the seized drugs represented somewhere between 27 million and 108 million individual doses. Obviously, not every gram would result in a separate dose, and much of the meth would be cut or diluted before reaching users. But the potential scale of harm from this quantity is staggering. The 7 superlabs they raided had a combined production capacity of approximately 1,000 pounds of methamphetamine per month when operating at full capacity. That means if these labs had continued operating undetected, they could have produced 12,000 pounds per year, or roughly 6 tons annually. From a financial perspective, the DEA estimates this seizure represents approximately $25 to $30 million in wholesale value, or potentially over $120 million if the drugs had been broken down and sold at retail prices. That's a significant financial loss for the Sinaloa cartel. But to put this in broader context, we need to understand the scale of methamphetamine trafficking in the United States. In fiscal year 2025, the DEA seized over 43,000 pounds of methamphetamine nationwide. The 6,000 pounds seized in this operation represents approximately 14% of the annual total, which shows what a significant bust this was. However, law enforcement officials estimate that seizures represent only a fraction of the total methamphetamine being produced and distributed. If DEA is interdicting 20–30% of meth trafficking, that would mean total methamphetamine availability in the U.S. is somewhere in the range of 150,000 to 200,000 pounds annually or more. The human cost of methamphetamine is severe. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, methamphetamine was involved in approximately 34,000 overdose deaths in 2024, up from just 1,900 in 2011, representing a staggering 1,700% increase over 13 years. While meth is less deadly per dose than fentanyl, it causes enormous damage through addiction, health consequences, and the criminal activity associated with supporting habits. Recent data shows that approximately 2.5 million Americans aged 12 or older reported using methamphetamine in the past year. The average age of first use is 23.3 years, and the rate of meth use disorder has increased by 43% over the past decade. Methamphetamine use is particularly prevalent in certain regions. The western states, including California, Arizona, and Nevada, where these labs were located, have historically had high rates of meth use. California alone accounts for approximately 25% of national meth consumption. But the drug has been spreading to other regions as cartel distribution networks have expanded. Between 2015 and 2023, meth-related emergency room visits increased by 180% in the South and 240% in the Northeast. The environmental cost of methamphetamine production is also significant. Each pound of meth produced generates approximately 5 to 7 pounds of toxic waste. That means the 3 tons seized in this operation were associated with approximately 15 to 21 tons of hazardous chemical waste. When labs operate in residential or agricultural areas, this waste contaminates soil and groundwater, creating long-term environmental damage and health risks for nearby communities. Cleanup of methamphetamine labs is expensive and dangerous. It requires specialized hazmat teams to safely remove chemicals and contaminated materials. The cost to clean up a single superlab can run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The EPA estimates the average superlab cleanup costs between $150,000 and $300,000. For the 7 labs rated in this operation, the total cleanup costs will likely exceed $2 million. Additionally, the agricultural warehouse in California was so contaminated that the building will need to be demolished rather than remediated. The soil beneath it is contaminated to a depth of approximately 4 feet and will require excavation and disposal at a hazardous waste facility, adding another $500,000 to the cleanup bill. What this tells us: this case demonstrates that Mexican drug cartels are increasingly willing to establish large-scale manufacturing operations inside the United States, not just in Mexico. This represents a strategic shift that makes enforcement more complicated. When most meth was produced in Mexico and smuggled across the border, border security was the primary choke point where law enforcement could intercept drugs. In 2024, Customs and Border Protection made 2,147 meth seizures at ports of entry, totaling over 35,000 pounds. But when cartels manufacture drugs inside the U.S., those drugs never cross the border, eliminating that enforcement opportunity. This means DEA and other agencies need to focus more resources on detecting and dismantling domestic manufacturing operations. They need to monitor chemical sales, investigate suspicious locations, and work with state and local partners who might encounter indicators of drug labs in their communities. Second, this case highlights the industrial scale of modern drug trafficking operations. These weren't small labs in residential kitchens cooking a few ounces at a time. These were sophisticated facilities with professional equipment and trained personnel producing hundreds of pounds per production cycle. The level of investment required to establish and operate 7 superlabs, DEA estimates the total startup costs at approximately $3 to $4 million, suggests that the cartels view this as a profitable long-term business strategy. They're not just smuggling drugs opportunistically, they're building infrastructure for sustained large-scale production. Third, this case raises questions about how cartels are able to obtain the chemicals and equipment needed for large-scale manufacturing. Despite regulations and monitoring programs, these operations acquired 2,000 pounds of precursor chemicals and extensive manufacturing equipment worth over $1.5 million in total. Are there gaps in how chemical sales are monitored? Are suppliers failing to report suspicious purchases? Are cartels using front companies or corrupted businesses to obtain materials? DEA records show that in 2024 alone, there were over 15,000 suspicious chemical transaction reports filed, but only about 8% resulted in investigations, suggesting the system is overwhelmed. Fourth, this case demonstrates the importance of multi-agency coordination that made the operation successful. DEA worked with state and local police, with federal partners including Homeland Security and ATF, with environmental agencies that handled hazmat cleanup, and with prosecutors who will bring the cases to trial. The operation involved over 300 law enforcement personnel from 17 different agencies. No single agency could have accomplished this alone. Success required sharing intelligence, coordinating operations, and bringing together specialized capabilities from multiple organizations. Where do we go from here? The 27 individuals arrested in this operation are currently in federal custody, facing serious drug manufacturing charges. Given the quantities involved, mandatory minimum sentencing laws will require that most defendants receive at least 10 years in federal prison if convicted. Many will likely face 20 years to life. The lead defendant, identified as the primary U.S. coordinator, faces a minimum of 30 years, with prosecutors seeking a life sentence. Some defendants may choose to cooperate with prosecutors, providing information about cartel operations in exchange for reduced sentences. This cooperation could lead to additional investigations and potentially to the identification and prosecution of cartel leadership. In similar past cases, approximately 40% of defendants have opted to cooperate. The 7 laboratory locations have been shut down and are being cleaned up by environmental specialists. The contaminated materials will be safely disposed of, and the properties will need to undergo extensive remediation before they can be used for any purpose again. The cleanup process is expected to take 6-9 months. The 3 tons of methamphetamine seized will be destroyed. Those drugs will never reach users, will never fuel addiction, will never contribute to overdose deaths or crime. DEA estimates this seizure will prevent approximately 34,000 potential overdoses and save an estimated 3,400 lives based on typical meth-related mortality rates. But we need to be realistic about the broader impact. This was a significant operation that dealt a blow to the Sinaloa cartel's manufacturing capacity. But the cartel has extensive resources and will work to rebuild what was lost. They'll establish new labs, recruit new workers, and resume production. Intelligence suggests the cartel has already moved to increase production at Mexican facilities to compensate for this loss. The methamphetamine problem in America is driven by demand. As long as millions of Americans want to use meth, there will be criminal organizations willing to produce and distribute it. Treatment admissions for methamphetamine addiction increased by 62% between 2015 and 2023, but only 11% of people with meth use disorder receive treatment. Enforcement operations like this one are essential for disrupting trafficking and holding criminals accountable, but they need to be part of a comprehensive strategy that also includes prevention, treatment, and addressing the underlying reasons why people turn to drugs. The DEA has made clear that targeting methamphetamine manufacturing, particularly large-scale superlab operations, remains a top priority. They're conducting investigations across the country and coordinating with partners in Mexico and other countries to attack this problem at every level. Currently, there are 47 active superlab investigations nationwide. For communities affected by methamphetamine, this operation provides some measure of hope that law enforcement is making progress. 3 tons of meth off the streets is 3 tons that won't destroy lives and families. But the fight continues. There will be more labs to find, more traffickers to arrest, more drugs to seize. This is a long-term challenge that requires sustained effort, resources, and commitment. I'll continue following major drug enforcement operations and reporting on the ongoing fight against methamphetamine trafficking. If you found this information valuable, please subscribe and share this video with others. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.